The day my stepson laughed in court and called me just a homemaker, the entire courtroom laughed with him. Even his expensive lawyer smiled like the outcome was already decided. But what Ryan Whittaker didn't know in that moment was something that would change everything. The judge sitting above him had seen my name years before, long before I ever married his father. And when that judge finally looked at me closely, the room grew very quiet. Before I tell you how that moment unfolded, let me ask you for a small favor. If stories about strength, dignity, and standing up for yourself speak to you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps these stories reach people who might need them more than they realize. Now, let me take you back to the beginning of the storm. My name is Helen Whittaker. I am 68 years old, and until a few weeks ago, most people who met me believed I was exactly what my stepson later called me in court. A quiet homemaker who spent her days tending the garden of a large coastal house and making sure dinner was ready before sunset. And for many years, that was the life I chose. My husband, Charles Whittaker, was 74 when he passed away. Charles was the founder of Whittaker Development Group, a construction company that began with one small renovation crew and eventually grew into one of the most respected real estate development firms in 3 states. For 40 years, he built towers, apartment complexes, and commercial centers across the country. But when I met Charles 23 years ago, he was simply a widower who had spent too many nights alone in hotel rooms and board meetings. He had tired eyes back then, kind eyes but tired. The only complicated part of Charles's life when we married was his son, Ryan Whittaker. Ryan was 21 at the time, charming, handsome, confident. The kind of young man who could make a room like him within 5 minutes. But charm and character are not the same thing. I had spent nearly 20 years studying people who looked respectable while quietly doing things they hoped no one would ever discover. Because long before I became Helen Whittaker the homemaker, I was Helen Whittaker the corporate compliance auditor. For 18 years, I worked with financial oversight teams investigating companies where money had started disappearing in ways that didn't quite make sense. My job was simple: follow the numbers. Numbers are honest, people often are not. But when Charles's health began to decline a few years ago, I stepped away from that world completely. My focus became him. The last 2 years of Charles's life were slow and difficult. His heart grew weaker, and the man who once walked through construction sites in heavy boots inspecting concrete foundations began needing help simply standing from his chair. I handled everything: medication schedules, doctor visits, late-night conversations when he couldn't sleep because the machines beside his bed made the room feel too quiet. During those 2 years, Ryan visited the house exactly 4 times. The first visit lasted less than 30 minutes. The second time he arrived, he spent most of it taking business calls in the driveway. The third time, he stayed long enough to ask about company documents. And the fourth time, he never even entered the house. He stood outside near the front gate and looked toward the windows where his father was resting. Then he turned to me and said something I will never forget. "You know, Helen, this kind of situation usually ends better if the patient is placed in a professional care facility." I stared at him. "Charles is comfortable at home," I replied. Ryan shrugged. "Watching him decline like this is uncomfortable." Uncomfortable, that was the word he chose, not sad, not difficult, uncomfortable. The only person who stayed beside me during those long months was Linda Alvarez. Linda had worked for the Whittaker household for nearly 20 years. She was 64, practical, strong, and the closest thing I had to a sister in this world. When Charles finally passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning, Linda was standing beside me in the living room. She was the one who held my hand when the machines stopped. Charles's funeral was held 4 days later under a gray sky that looked as though it might rain at any moment. The cemetery overlooked the ocean cliffs outside the city. I remember standing beside the grave holding a single white rose while Linda supported my arm to keep me steady. Across from me stood Ryan. He wore a tailored black suit that fit him perfectly. His hair was immaculate. His expression calm, but he did not cry. Instead, he watched everything with the quiet attention of someone studying a financial transaction. Standing beside him was a man I had never met before but immediately recognized by reputation. Daniel Mercer. Daniel Mercer was 56 and widely known as one of the most aggressive probate attorneys in the state. His specialty was dismantling estate agreements and redistributing assets in ways that favored his clients. People said he rarely lost. When I saw Mercer lean close and whisper something into Ryan's ear at the gravesite, a quiet feeling settled in my stomach. Linda noticed it too. She leaned toward me and murmured softly, "That man didn't come here to mourn." I told her she was imagining things. Looking back now, I should have trusted her instincts. After the funeral ended and people began leaving, I stayed behind for a moment. I placed my rose gently on Charles's casket. When I turned around, Ryan was standing directly behind me on the gravel path. "Helen," he said. "Ryan," his voice was calm, almost polite. "I'll give you a few days," he continued. "But we need to discuss the estate." I frowned slightly. "Your father handled his estate planning years ago," Ryan smiled. But there was something unsettling about that smile. "Things change," he said, then he walked away. 3 days later, the doorbell rang at exactly 10 in the morning. Linda was in the kitchen making coffee when I opened the door. Ryan stepped inside without waiting to be invited. Behind him stood Daniel Mercer holding a leather briefcase thick with documents. Within minutes, we were seated in the living room where Charles and I had spent so many quiet evenings reading together. Mercer opened his briefcase slowly. Then he slid a stack of papers across the table toward me. "Mrs. Whittaker," he said in a calm voice that sounded rehearsed, "my client is formally contesting the validity of Charles Whittaker's will." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. "On what grounds?" I asked quietly. Mercer folded his hands. "Undue influence." Ryan leaned back comfortably in his chair. "Our position," Mercer continued, "is that during Mr. Whittaker's illness you isolated him from his family and manipulated him into altering his estate." I stared at them both. "You're accusing me of manipulating my husband while he was dying?" Mercer didn't blink. "We believe Mr. Whittaker was not of sound mind when his final will was executed." Ryan spoke again. "Until the court reviews everything, all estate assets will be frozen." My chest tightened. "What exactly does that mean?" Mercer slid another document across the table. "It means the company, financial accounts, and this property are under temporary legal review." Ryan stood and adjusted his jacket. Then he looked down at me and said the sentence that changed everything. "You'll need to vacate the house within 30 days. Linda dropped a coffee cup in the kitchen when she heard that. The sound shattered against the floor, but Ryan didn't react. He simply gave me the same polite smile he had worn at the cemetery. "You've lived comfortably here long enough, Helen," he said. "Now it's time the family takes back what belongs to them." They walked out of my home 10 minutes later. Linda came into the living room shaking with anger. "They planned this," she whispered. But I wasn't angry, not yet. I was thinking, because Ryan Whittaker wasn't behaving like someone hoping to win a court case. He was behaving like someone who already believed he had won. And that raised a question I couldn't ignore. What did Ryan know that I didn't? The answer to that question would come sooner than I expected. Because the next morning when I drove to the bank to withdraw money for a lawyer, I discovered Ryan had already made his first move. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't just a legal dispute. It was a trap. The first time I realized how carefully Ryan Whittaker had planned everything, it wasn't in a courtroom. It was inside a quiet bank office, when a man who had known my husband for years looked at me with genuine regret and said words I never expected to hear. "Mrs. Whittaker, I'm afraid your accounts are no longer accessible." But before I explain how my own money suddenly became untouchable, you need to understand something about people like my stepson Ryan. They don't start battles they aren't certain they can win. The morning after Ryan and his lawyer Daniel Mercer walked out of my home with those legal papers, the house felt strangely different. Every room seemed larger than it had the day before. Silence filled the halls where Charles's voice once echoed. I woke up before sunrise that morning. Old habits from my earlier career never really leave you. When you've spent years investigating financial corruption, your mind begins connecting pieces the moment something doesn't feel right. And something about Ryan's confidence the day before had been deeply unsettling. He wasn't behaving like a man hoping to win a legal dispute. He was behaving like someone who had already arranged the outcome. Linda Alvarez was already awake when I came downstairs. Linda, my trusted friend and house manager for nearly 20 years, was standing at the kitchen counter making coffee. She turned when she heard my footsteps. "You didn't sleep," she said immediately. I smiled faintly. "I rested enough." Linda crossed her arms and studied my face. She had known me long enough to recognize when I was thinking through something carefully. "That boy thinks he can scare you away," she said. "But he forgets who you are." I didn't respond right away, because the truth was Ryan might not remember the woman I used to be, but the systems he was manipulating certainly would. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table where Charles and I had spent countless mornings together. "Linda," I said quietly, "do you remember the personal account Charles insisted I open a few years ago?" She nodded immediately. "The one he said was only for you." 5 years earlier, when Charles's heart problems first began appearing, he had insisted I keep a personal account separate from everything else. "Just in case something ever happens," he had told me gently. There was a little over $200,000 in that account, enough to hire a very good attorney, enough to challenge anything Daniel Mercer might try in court. "I'm going to the bank," I said calmly. Linda set a cup of coffee in front of me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Be careful today," she said softly. I didn't realize how important that warning would become until less than an hour later. The downtown branch of Whitestone Financial had always been quiet and polished, the kind of place where people discussed investments in low voices while sunlight reflected off marble floors. Charles and I had banked there for nearly 15 years. The senior compliance officer, Michael Bennett, had attended several company dinners and even visited our home during a holiday gathering once. So when I walked through the glass doors that morning, I expected a normal conversation. Instead, the moment Michael Bennett saw me standing outside his office, something changed in his expression. Not the polite sympathy people offer to someone who recently lost a spouse, something else. "Concern, Mrs. Whittaker," he said quietly. "Please come in." He closed the office door behind me. Then he sat down across from me, folding his hands together slowly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I need to withdraw funds from my personal account," I said. "I need to retain legal counsel." Michael inhaled slowly before answering. "I was hoping you wouldn't come today." That sentence alone told me everything I needed to know. "What happened?" I asked calmly. He turned his computer monitor so I could see the screen. My account information appeared immediately, but across the top of the page was a red notification I had never seen before. "Legal hold, court order." My pulse slowed instead of rising. When you've spent years dealing with financial investigations, panic rarely helps. Understanding the mechanism always does. "Explain," I said quietly. Michael leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Late yesterday afternoon, Daniel Mercer filed an emergency motion through probate court." My hands remained folded calmly in my lap. "What kind of motion?" "A request to freeze all financial assets connected to Charles Whittaker's estate until the court determines ownership." I shook my head. "This account is in my name alone." Michael nodded. "I know. Then why is it frozen?" He hesitated. "Mercer argued that because you haven't had independent employment income for many years, the funds likely originated from Whittaker Development Group accounts." I stared at him. "They're claiming the money belongs to the company?" "They're claiming it might belong to the estate," he corrected gently. "Until a judge reviews the case, the court approved a temporary hold." I leaned back slightly in the chair. Inside my mind, something had begun working again, the same quiet analysis that used to guide my investigations years ago. Because that motion had not been filed simply to protect the estate. It had been filed to isolate me. "How many accounts are frozen?" I asked. Michael hesitated. "All joint accounts connected to Charles Whittaker. And this one?" "Yes," I nodded slowly, which meant Ryan and Daniel Mercer had already executed the first stage of their strategy. They had removed my financial independence. Without access to funds, I couldn't hire legal representation. And without legal representation, Mercer would dominate the courtroom. Michael looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Whittaker, if there was something I could legally do—" "I understand," I said softly. I opened my purse and checked my wallet. $47. That was the total amount of cash I had available. Ryan Whittaker had essentially cut off my resources overnight. For most people, that would have ended the fight before it began. I stood up from the chair. Michael stood as well. "I'm very sorry," he said quietly. Thank you for being honest with me, I replied. I walked out of the bank and into the cold morning air. Cars moved along the street. People walked past carrying coffee cups and briefcases, completely unaware that my entire financial life had just been placed behind a legal barrier. I sat inside my car for several minutes, staring through the windshield. Not in panic, in thought, because something about Ryan's urgency still didn't make sense. If Whitaker Development Group truly held the value Mercer claimed in court filings, nearly $90 million, then why was Ryan acting so desperate to control everything immediately? Freezing my accounts, forcing me out of the house, attempting to push the case forward before I could even hire legal help. That level of urgency usually meant only one thing: someone was afraid of something being discovered. And people who hide things always leave traces behind. I started the car, but instead of driving toward a law office, I drove home. Because if Ryan Whitaker believed freezing my bank account meant the battle was already over, he had forgotten one very important detail about the woman he had just challenged. Long before I became Charles Whitaker's wife, I spent nearly 20 years following financial trails that powerful people believed no one could see. And the moment I walked back into the house that afternoon, I realized there was one place Ryan had never expected me to look: Charles's private study, the place where the truth about everything might still be waiting. And once I opened the first set of financial files inside that room, I would finally understand why Ryan Whitaker was so desperate to win the case quickly. When I walked into Charles's private study that afternoon, I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for answers. Because when someone freezes your bank accounts, hires one of the most aggressive probate attorneys in the state, and tries to force you out of your home within 30 days, they are not simply confident. They are afraid of something being discovered, and I intended to find out what that was. Charles's study was at the far end of the house overlooking the ocean cliffs. For decades it had been the room where Whitaker Development Group was built, contract by contract, blueprint by blueprint. Even after Charles's health began failing, he never allowed anyone to reorganize it. Not even me. Some systems only make sense to the person who created them, he used to say with a small smile. As I stepped inside that room again, the faint smell of leather and old paper greeted me like a memory that had been waiting quietly. Linda Alvarez stood in the doorway behind me, her arms folded. "You haven't been in here since Charles passed," she said gently. "No," I replied. For a moment I simply stood there, letting my eyes move across the room. Charles's desk was exactly the way he had left it, a wide oak surface. A brass lamp, neatly stacked folders, and the framed photograph he kept beside the computer. It showed the three of us at a company celebration nearly 10 years earlier. Charles smiling proudly, his arm around my shoulder. Ryan standing beside him in a tailored suit with the confident expression he always wore in public. Back then everything looked perfect, but appearances are often the most convincing disguise. I sat down in Charles's chair and slowly opened the first drawer of the desk. Contracts, vendor agreements, project proposals, nothing unusual, but that didn't surprise me. When people hide financial manipulation, they rarely leave the evidence sitting in plain sight. Instead, they hide it inside patterns. And patterns only reveal themselves when you examine enough information over time. "Linda," I said quietly, "when did Ryan start getting involved in the company's vendor approvals?" She thought for a moment. "About 5 years ago," she answered. "Charles said it was time for his son to learn the business." 5 years. That number settled in my mind immediately. 5 years earlier was also when Charles's heart condition first started affecting his schedule. That meant fewer site visits, fewer financial reviews, more responsibility placed in Ryan's hands. Coincidences in financial systems are rarely accidents. I opened Charles's computer and entered his password. Unlike most modern executives, Charles never trusted complicated cloud systems. He preferred keeping sensitive records stored locally where he could monitor them himself. The desktop screen appeared with several familiar folders: company accounts, vendor contracts, quarterly financial summaries. I began opening them one by one. At first everything appeared normal: development profits, construction invoices, payroll transfers. But about 20 minutes into reviewing the files, something made my hand pause on the keyboard. A payment record, consulting services, $280,000. I leaned closer to the screen. Consulting payments weren't unusual in large real estate development companies. Businesses often hire outside consultants for engineering reviews, zoning compliance, and market forecasting. But something about this payment felt repetitive. I searched the vendor name, Apex Urban Solutions. Another entry appeared. 3 months later, $400,000, then another, $200,000, and another, $500,000. Always the same company, always labeled as consulting services. I grabbed a notebook from the desk and began writing down the dates. January, April, August, December. Over the next hour, I traced the pattern backward through financial reports spanning 5 years. By the time I finished calculating the totals, the number on the page made my chest tighten. $37 million. Nearly $40 million had quietly left Whitaker Development Group over 5 years through consulting payments to Apex Urban Solutions. That alone would raise serious questions in any compliance audit. But the next discovery made the situation far more troubling, because when I searched the corporate registration database for Apex Urban Solutions, the company did not appear anywhere. Not in state records, not in national filings. It was as if the company didn't exist at all. I leaned back slowly in the chair. "Linda," I said quietly. She stepped closer. "Yes, have you ever heard Charles mention a company called Apex Urban Solutions?" She shook her head immediately. "No, that was unusual. Charles discussed most of his business relationships openly at home. But something about these transactions felt wrong in a deeper way. Large, regular payments to a company that seemed invisible. I opened another folder on Charles's computer labeled Vendor Authorization. Inside were scanned documents approving contractor payments signed by company executives. And then I saw it. The authorization form for Apex Urban Solutions, signed electronically. Ryan Whitaker. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Behind me, Linda watched my expression carefully. "Helen," she said quietly, "what did you find?" I turned the monitor slightly so she could see the document. "That," I said softly, "is why Ryan is trying so hard to push me out of the estate." Linda leaned closer, squinting at the signature. "I don't understand." "Charles trusted Ryan to approve vendor payments during the last few years," I explained slowly. "Which means Ryan had the authority to release funds." Linda looked back at the numbers. And someone authorized nearly $40 million in consulting payments to a company that does not appear to exist. Her eyes widened. "You're saying Ryan?" "Yes." I closed the laptop gently. Ryan wasn't trying to reclaim his father's company. I looked toward the window where the ocean waves moved slowly below the cliffs. He was trying to hide something? The room felt very quiet then, because suddenly everything Ryan had done made perfect sense. Freezing my accounts, forcing me out of the house, hiring Daniel Mercer to challenge Charles's will. If I inherited Charles's estate, I would eventually gain access to the company's internal financial records. And if I reviewed those records carefully, I would find exactly what I had just discovered. $40 million had disappeared. And Ryan Whitaker had approved every transfer. Linda covered her mouth with one hand. "My God," I nodded slowly. "Now we understand why he's rushing this case." She looked at me carefully. "What are you going to do?" I stood up from the desk. And for the first time since Charles died, something inside me felt very familiar. Focus. The quiet determination I used to feel when an investigation finally revealed the truth hidden beneath layers of deception. "Ryan believes freezing my accounts means I cannot fight back," I said calmly. "And Daniel Mercer believes I'm just a homemaker who doesn't understand financial evidence." Linda nodded slowly. "They're wrong." I looked once more at the numbers in my notebook. "Yes," I said softly, "they are." But there was still one problem. Discovering the truth inside Charles's study was one thing. Proving it in court was something entirely different. Because lawyers like Daniel Mercer do not lose cases easily. And Ryan Whitaker still believed the courtroom would belong to him. What neither of them realized yet was that the moment they filed that lawsuit, they had unknowingly invited someone back into a world she once knew very well. A courtroom, and very soon, Ryan Whitaker was going to learn exactly why some financial trails should never be followed. The night I discovered the missing money inside Charles's study, I didn't sleep at all. Not because I was afraid, but because something inside me had awakened again after many years of silence. You see, when my stepson Ryan stood in my living room and told me I had 30 days to leave my own home, he believed he was dealing with a helpless widow. What he didn't understand was that some skills never truly disappear. They simply wait until the moment they are needed again. That night, long after Linda Alvarez had gone to bed, I remained alone in Charles's study. The ocean outside the windows was dark, and the quiet rhythm of waves crashing against the cliffs filled the room with a strange sense of calm. I sat at Charles's desk staring at the numbers I had written in my notebook. $37 million, 5 years of consulting payments, all authorized by Ryan Whittaker. It was a clever scheme. Create a consulting company that appears legitimate. Authorize payments slowly over time. Move the money offshore where few people ever look closely, and hope that no one inside the company ever notices the pattern. But something about it still bothered me. Charles had been many things in his life, but careless with business was not one of them. Even during the years when his health began failing, he remained careful about financial oversight, which meant if millions of dollars were disappearing from his company, he probably noticed. And if Charles noticed something suspicious, he would not ignore it. I leaned forward in the chair, studying the desk again. For years, I had watched him work in this room. He had habits, patterns, places he kept things that mattered. "Linda," I called quietly. A few moments later, she appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a robe. "You're still awake?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I think Charles knew something was wrong before he died." Linda stepped closer. "What makes you say that?" I tapped the notebook filled with numbers. "These transfers started 5 years ago. Charles's illness became serious about 2 years later. If he noticed the money disappearing before that, he would have started investigating." Linda frowned slightly. "But you said there were no notes about it." "Not in the obvious places," I replied. I stood up and began looking around the room more carefully. Charles had always been cautious. If he suspected someone inside the company was stealing money, he would not leave the evidence sitting on top of his desk. Instead, he would hide it somewhere safe until he could confirm what was happening. I moved toward the large painting hanging on the wall behind his desk. It showed the city skyline 20 years earlier when Whittaker Development Group completed its first major project downtown. Charles loved that painting, but as I looked closer, something felt unusual about it. I reached up and carefully lifted it from the wall. Behind the painting was a small steel safe built directly into the wall. Linda gasped softly behind me. "I didn't even know that was there." I smiled faintly. Charles liked to plan ahead. The safe had a keypad lock. I stood there for a moment thinking about the numbers Charles would have chosen. People rarely choose complicated codes for things they want to remember easily. Most choose dates that matter to them. Our wedding anniversary came to mind. I entered the numbers slowly. The safe clicked open. Inside were only 2 things: a small black notebook and a silver flash drive. My hands moved carefully as I removed the notebook first. The pages were filled with Charles's handwriting, numbers, vendor names, dates, payment records. It took only a few seconds for me to recognize what I was looking at. Charles had been conducting his own private investigation. I turned the page slowly. At the top of the next page, Charles had written a short message. "Helen, if you ever find this, it means I wasn't able to finish what I started." My chest tightened slightly as I read the words. Charles had known something was wrong. The notebook continued with detailed notes about suspicious consulting payments leaving Whittaker Development Group. Every entry referenced the same company name, Apex Urban Solutions. The same company I had discovered earlier that evening in the financial records. And beside each payment entry, Charles had written the same 2 initials. RW, Ryan Whittaker. Linda leaned over my shoulder. "He knew," she whispered. "Yes," I said quietly. "He knew something wasn't right." The final page of the notebook contained another message written in Charles's careful handwriting. "If I'm gone before this is resolved, I trust you to follow the numbers. You always see what others miss." I felt my throat tighten slightly. Charles had known exactly who he married. He knew I would understand what he had discovered. I set the notebook aside and picked up the flash drive. Linda watched nervously. "What do you think is on it?" "Let's find out," I said. I inserted the flash drive into Charles's computer. One file appeared on the screen, a video recording. I clicked it open. Charles appeared sitting in the living room where his hospital bed had been during the final months of his illness. He looked tired, thinner than I remembered, but his eyes were clear. "Helen," he said gently, "if you're watching this, it means I didn't have time to solve the problem inside the company." He paused briefly to catch his breath. "For the past few years, I've noticed money leaving Whitaker Development Group through consulting payments that don't make sense." My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the desk. Charles continued speaking slowly. "At first I believed it was simply bad business decisions, but the more I reviewed the records, the more the pattern worried me." He looked directly into the camera. "The payments were approved by Ryan?" Linda covered her mouth quietly behind me. "I wanted to investigate further," Charles continued, "but my health hasn't allowed me to finish." His voice softened slightly. "That's why I'm leaving this to the one person I trust more than anyone else." A small smile touched his face. "You." The video ended. The room fell completely silent. For several moments neither Linda nor I spoke. Finally she said quietly, "He believed in you." I nodded slowly. "He always did." Everything Ryan had done now made perfect sense. The lawsuit, freezing my accounts, hiring Daniel Mercer. Ryan wasn't just trying to win the estate. He was trying to erase the one person who might discover the truth Charles had already begun uncovering. If I inherited the company, I would eventually gain full access to the financial records. And if I followed the trail far enough, the missing money would lead straight back to Ryan. I closed the laptop gently. "What are you going to do now?" Linda asked. I walked toward the window overlooking the dark ocean. For 20 years, I had avoided the world of investigations and courtroom battles. Charles had given me something better, peace. But now someone had tried to destroy everything he built. And worse, that someone was his own son. "Ryan thinks I'm trapped," I said quietly. "He believes freezing my accounts means I cannot fight back." Linda nodded. "But you can." I turned back toward Charles's desk where the notebook and flash drive rested beside each other. Together they formed the beginning of a financial trail. But suspicion alone would not be enough in court. To expose Ryan, I would need proof strong enough to stand in front of a judge. And Daniel Mercer would do everything possible to stop that from happening. Because men like Mercer did not build their reputations by losing easy cases. But Ryan Whitaker had made one very important mistake. By filing that lawsuit, he had forced this entire situation into a courtroom. And courtrooms have always been the one place where hidden financial trails eventually come into the light. The only question now was how long it would take before Ryan realized that the investigation his father started had just begun again. The first time my stepson laughed at me inside the courtroom, the sound spread through the room like a quiet ripple. A few people in the gallery chuckled. Even Daniel Mercer, Ryan's expensive attorney, allowed himself a faint smile as if the entire situation had already been decided. And for a moment, everyone in that courtroom believed exactly what Ryan believed. That I was simply a quiet widow who had wandered into a legal battle far beyond her understanding. But courtrooms have a way of revealing truths people don't expect. And that morning, the truth had only just begun to unfold. The courthouse stood in the center of the city like a heavy gray monument, its stone walls and tall columns carrying decades of legal battles within them. I hadn't walked through courthouse doors in nearly 20 years, but the moment I stepped inside that building, something about the atmosphere felt familiar. The quiet conversations, the sound of shoes echoing across marble floors. The careful way people watched each other while pretending not to. Linda Alvarez stood beside me near the courtroom doors, gripping her purse tightly. She had insisted on coming with me even though she hated legal confrontations. "Are you sure you want to do this alone?" she whispered nervously. "You should have a lawyer." I gave her a small, reassuring smile. "If I had access to my accounts, I probably would." Ryan and Daniel Mercer had made sure that wasn't possible. By freezing my finances, they believed they had removed my ability to fight back. In their minds, today would be the beginning of the end. The courtroom doors opened and people began filing inside. Ryan Whitaker was already seated at the plaintiff's table when I walked in. He looked exactly the way he always did in public. Expensive suit, perfect posture. The confident smile of a man who had never truly believed consequences applied to him. Beside him sat Daniel Mercer. 56 years old, silver hair, thin glasses, and the calm expression of a man who had built his career dismantling people in rooms just like this one. When Ryan saw me walk in alone, he leaned toward Mercer and whispered something. Mercer glanced briefly in my direction, then gave a small dismissive nod. They both looked completely relaxed, as if they were watching someone walk willingly into a trap. I took my seat quietly at the defense table with nothing but a folder and a notepad. No legal team, no assistants, just me. Within minutes, the courtroom doors closed again and the judge entered. Judge Samuel Carter, 62 years old, respected throughout the state for his strict courtroom discipline and his reputation for noticing details others overlooked. The entire room stood as he took his seat. "You may be seated," he said calmly. Papers shuffled quietly as people settled. Judge Carter opened the case file in front of him. "Estate of Charles Whittaker," he announced. His eyes moved across the room until they reached me. "Mrs. Whittaker," he said evenly, "I don't see legal counsel representing you." "I will represent myself, Your Honor," I replied calmly. A faint murmur moved through the spectators behind me. Self-representation in probate court was rare. Most people avoided it unless they had no other option. Judge Carter studied me for a moment. "That is rarely advisable," he said. "I understand that," I answered. He nodded once and turned toward the plaintiff's table. Daniel Mercer stood immediately. "Your Honor, my client Ryan Whittaker regrets that this matter must be brought before the court. However, we believe Charles Whittaker's final will was executed under questionable circumstances." His voice carried across the courtroom smoothly, practiced, and confident. During the final months of Mr. Whittaker's illness, Mrs. Whittaker isolated him from family members and controlled his financial decisions. I remained completely still as he spoke. Mercer continued building the narrative carefully. A grieving son, a vulnerable dying father, a widow who supposedly manipulated him into rewriting the will. It was a convincing story if you didn't look too closely. Finally, Mercer gestured toward Ryan. "My client believes the estate should be redistributed according to Charles Whittaker's earlier documented intentions." Ryan stood, straightening his jacket. "My father built Whittaker Development Group over 40 years, he said calmly. And suddenly everything was left to someone who had nothing to do with the business. He glanced toward me with a polite smile. "Helen never cared about the company," he added. "She was just a homemaker." A few quiet laughs came from the back of the courtroom. "Housewife, homemaker." The words floated through the room like quiet judgment. Judge Carter raised a hand and the room settled again. "Mr. Whittaker," he said firmly, "you will allow your attorney to speak for you." Ryan nodded, but the smile remained on his face. Mercer continued outlining his argument. "Mrs. Whittaker has not held employment in over 2 decades, he explained. This raises serious concerns regarding her ability to manage a development company valued at nearly $90 million. Ryan leaned back in his chair again, clearly enjoying the moment. To him, the outcome already felt certain. Finally, Judge Carter turned his attention toward me. "Mrs. Whittaker," he said calmly, "would you like to respond?" I stood slowly. For a moment, I simply looked at Ryan. Then I addressed the judge. "Yes, Your Honor, I would like to request access to the company's full financial records before this case proceeds further." Daniel Mercer frowned slightly. "On what grounds?" he asked. I answered calmly. "Because the financial condition of Whittaker Development Group may directly affect the estate being disputed." Mercer smiled thinly. "Your Honor, this is a probate matter. The company's internal finances are irrelevant." Judge Carter leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Whittaker," he said, "do you believe there is a financial issue within the company?" I paused deliberately, timing matters in court. Revealing information too quickly can give the other side time to prepare a defense. "I believe the financial records may clarify certain misunderstandings," I said carefully. Ryan laughed softly. "Your Honor, with respect, Helen doesn't understand corporate finances." More quiet chuckles spread through the gallery, but something interesting happened next. Judge Carter didn't laugh. Instead, he looked at me more closely, studying my face, as if something about me seemed familiar. Then he said something that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. "Mrs. Whittaker," he said slowly, "have we met before?" Ryan's smile faded slightly. Mercer straightened in his chair. I answered calmly, Possibly, Your Honor, many years ago. Judge Carter leaned back, thinking. Your name sounds familiar, he said. Did you ever work in financial investigations? A ripple of curiosity moved through the courtroom. I nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. Mercer's expression changed immediately. He was beginning to understand something Ryan clearly did not. Judge Carter studied me for another moment. Helen Whitaker, he said thoughtfully. Were you previously Helen Whitaker Carter? I nodded again. Yes. The room fell completely silent, because suddenly the narrative Mercer had been building no longer made sense. The helpless widow, the inexperienced homemaker. That story was beginning to collapse. Judge Carter looked down at the case file again, then back at me. I remember now, he said quietly. You were involved in several major corporate fraud investigations about 20 years ago. Ryan's face went pale. Wait, what? He muttered under his breath. Mercer closed his eyes briefly, realizing the mistake they had made. I remained calm. Yes, Your Honor. The judge nodded slowly. Very well, he said. Then perhaps Mrs. Whitaker's request to review the company's financial records deserves careful consideration. Ryan stared at me now, the confidence gone from his expression. Because for the first time since this entire situation began, he understood something important. The woman he believed he could intimidate out of his father's estate had just turned his lawsuit into something very different. An investigation. And investigations have a way of uncovering truths that people work very hard to keep hidden. What Ryan still didn't realize yet was that the financial trail his father started following before he died was about to lead straight back to him. When Judge Samuel Carter said my name sounded familiar, the entire courtroom grew strangely quiet. The laughter that had followed Ryan's comment about me being just a homemaker faded quickly, replaced by something far more interesting: curiosity. Ryan Whitaker didn't understand what was happening yet, but Daniel Mercer did. I could see it in the way his posture changed almost immediately. A lawyer who has spent decades in courtrooms develops a sharp instinct for danger. And in that moment, Mercer realized something had shifted in the room. Judge Carter leaned slightly forward in his chair, studying me carefully. Mrs. Whitaker, he said slowly, I believe your name appeared in several financial fraud prosecutions many years ago. I nodded calmly. Yes, Your Honor. Ryan looked from me to his attorney, confused. What does that mean? He whispered to Mercer. Mercer didn't answer him right away. Instead, he cleared his throat and stood again. Your Honor, he said smoothly, while Mrs. Whitaker's past career is certainly impressive, it does not change the matter before this court. The judge raised a hand gently, silencing him. Mr. Mercer, I will determine what matters in my courtroom. That sentence landed like a quiet hammer across the room. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The confidence he had carried into the hearing was beginning to crack. Judge Carter turned back toward me. Mrs. Whitaker, you requested access to the company's financial records before this court proceeds further. Do you still believe that review is necessary? Yes, Your Honor, I answered calmly. Very much so. Mercer stepped forward quickly. Your Honor, this request is clearly a delay tactic. The validity of Mr. Whitaker's will has nothing to do with the internal accounting of Whitaker Development Group. I remained still, waiting. Timing is everything in court. The judge looked toward me again. Mrs. Whitaker, are you suggesting the company's financial condition may be relevant to this case? I took a slow breath. Yes, Your Honor. I believe there may be irregularities within the company's financial records. The word irregularities spread through the courtroom like a ripple across water. People began whispering quietly in the gallery seats behind us. Ryan laughed nervously. Irregularities, he said. My father's company is worth nearly $90 million. I didn't look at him. Instead, I addressed the judge. The record suggests something different. Mercer's voice sharpened slightly. Your Honor, unless Mrs. Whitaker has verified documentation, this claim is nothing more than speculation. I opened the folder I had brought with me. Inside were the copies of financial entries I had discovered in Charles's study the night before. I stepped forward and placed the documents on the clerk's desk. These are the beginning of the financial trail, I said quietly. Judge Carter began reading through the pages. The courtroom grew silent again. Ryan's smile disappeared entirely now, because the documents in front of the judge showed exactly what I had discovered, large consulting payments leaving Whitaker Development Group over the last 5 years. Finally, the judge looked up. These records show multiple payments to a company called Apex Urban Solutions. Yes, Your Honor, Ryan shifted in his chair. Those are consulting contracts, he said quickly. Judge Carter turned a page. Several $1 million in consulting fees. Ryan forced a casual shrug. Large development companies hire consultants all the time. The judge continued reading. The total amount transferred appears to exceed $37 million. That number caused a wave of murmurs throughout the courtroom. Ryan's voice tightened slightly. International consulting is expensive. I remained silent. Mercer spoke again, clearly trying to regain control of the moment. Your Honor, without a full financial audit, these documents prove nothing. I waited until the room settled again before speaking, which is exactly why I requested access to the company's complete financial records. Judge Carter leaned back thoughtfully. Ryan's confidence was fading fast now, because even though nothing had been proven yet, the direction of the case had begun to change. Instead of a widow defending a will, the courtroom was beginning to examine the company itself. And Ryan understood something very important about that shift. If the court allowed a deeper investigation into Whitaker Development Group's finances, the truth might surface. Mercer sensed the danger as well. Your Honor, he said carefully, opening a full corporate audit during a probate dispute would be unnecessary and extremely disruptive. The judge looked at him calmly. Disruptive to whom? Mercer hesitated. Ryan leaned forward suddenly. This is ridiculous, he said. Helen doesn't understand how business operations work. I finally turned to look at him. Your father trusted you with financial approvals, I said quietly. Ryan stiffened slightly. Of course he did, I nodded. Which means you authorized the consulting payments. Mercer stepped forward quickly. Your Honor, but Judge Carter raised his hand again. Mrs. Whitaker, are you implying that Mr. Whitaker approved these transfers personally? The authorization signatures appear to indicate that, I replied. The courtroom became completely silent again. Ryan's eyes flashed with irritation. You're trying to accuse me of something now, he snapped. I didn't answer him. Instead, I looked at the judge. I'm simply following the numbers. Judge Carter studied the documents again. His expression remained calm, but I could see the gears turning in his mind. Finally, he closed the folder and spoke. This court will grant Mrs. Whitaker limited access to Whitaker Development Group's financial records. Ryan stood up instantly. What? Mercer looked equally stunned, but the judge continued calmly. If there are irregularities affecting the value of the estate, the court has a responsibility to review them. The gavel tapped lightly on the bench. This hearing will resume in 3 days. The courtroom erupted in whispers as people began gathering their belongings. Ryan remained standing, staring at me across the room. The arrogance in his expression had disappeared. In its place was something far more revealing. Fear. Mercer leaned toward him and spoke quietly, but I caught a few of the words. You didn't tell me about those payments. Ryan whispered something back angrily. I collected my papers calmly. Linda approached me from the back of the room, her eyes wide. Did that just happen? She asked quietly. I nodded. Yes, she leaned closer. Ryan looks like he just realized something. I glanced across the courtroom where Ryan was still speaking urgently with Mercer. He did, I said softly. Because Ryan Whitaker had just learned something he should have understood from the beginning. The moment he dragged this matter into court, he invited someone to examine the one thing he had hoped no one would ever examine: the money. And once someone begins following money, the truth has a habit of catching up very quickly. What Ryan didn't know yet was that the financial trail he started 5 years ago was about to lead somewhere he could no longer escape. The moment Judge Samuel Carter granted access to Whitaker Development Group's financial records, something changed in the entire case. Until that moment, Ryan Whitaker believed he was in complete control. He thought this courtroom was simply a place where his lawyer, Daniel Mercer, would dismantle a grieving widow and reclaim his father's estate. But the second the judge allowed the company's finances to be examined, the story stopped being about a will. It became about the money. And money has a way of telling the truth when people try very hard to hide it. As people began leaving the courtroom that afternoon, I noticed Ryan standing near the hallway exit speaking urgently with Mercer. The relaxed confidence he carried earlier had disappeared completely. Mercer looked tense, flipping through documents and whispering sharply while Ryan shook his head. Both of them glanced toward me more than once. I pretended not to notice and calmly gathered my papers. Linda Alvarez walked beside me as we stepped into the courthouse hallway. "Did you see his face?" she whispered quietly. "He looked like someone who just realized the lights turned on in a dark room." I allowed myself a small smile. That's usually what happens when someone realizes their secret might not stay secret. But I knew better than to celebrate too soon. Suspicion alone means very little in court. Evidence is what wins cases, and evidence begins with numbers. The next morning, I started where any financial investigation should begin, with the person who had already seen the first sign that something was wrong. Michael Bennett? Michael was the senior bank compliance officer who had informed me my accounts were frozen the day after Ryan filed his lawsuit. But Michael also monitored large corporate transfers connected to Whitaker Development Group. If the company's money had been moved through the banking system, Michael would have seen it. His office overlooked the downtown financial district when Linda and I arrived. Michael greeted us with the same uneasy expression he had worn during our previous conversation. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said quietly as he closed his office door. "I assume this visit is related to the court hearing?" "It is," I replied. I placed a document on his desk. It was one of the consulting payment records from Charles's computer. "I need to confirm whether your bank processed these transfers." Michael adjusted his glasses and studied the paper carefully. His eyebrows rose slightly as he read the vendor name. "Apex Urban Solutions," he murmured. He turned toward his computer and began searching through the transaction database. The room remained silent except for the soft clicking of keys. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Yes," he said slowly. "Our bank processed several of these transfers." "Several?" I asked. Michael turned the monitor so I could see it. The list of transactions filled the screen, payment after payment. Consulting services, 200,000, 400,000, 500,000. Each one authorized by Whitaker Development Group. Linda leaned closer to the screen. "How many are there?" she asked. Michael hesitated slightly before answering. "Over 5 years, the total exceeds $37 million. Even though I already knew the approximate number, hearing it confirmed inside the bank's system carried a different weight. Because now the numbers weren't just notes from Charles's investigation, they were verified financial records. "Where did the money go?" I asked. Michael hesitated again. "Normally, I wouldn't be able to discuss corporate transfers without authorization." I placed another document on his desk. Judge Carter's signed order granting me access to Whitaker Development Group's financial records. Michael read the document carefully and nodded. "In that case, yes." He turned back to the screen and opened another window showing the receiving accounts. "The payments were sent to a holding account connected to Apex Urban Solutions." Linda frowned. "But that company doesn't appear to exist." Michael nodded slowly. "That's correct." He tapped another key. A new page appeared. "The receiving account is registered through an offshore banking institution." I leaned slightly closer to the screen. "Cayman International Financial Services, offshore accounts. The place where financial trails are designed to disappear." Linda inhaled sharply behind me. "That's where the money went?" she asked. Michael nodded. "Over 5 years, yes." I watched the screen carefully, but something else caught my attention. "Michael," I said quietly, "who authorized the transfers?" He opened another file connected to the transactions. The authorization signature appeared at the bottom of the document. "Ryan Whitaker." Linda whispered something softly in Spanish, but Michael wasn't finished. "There's another detail you should see," he added. He scrolled further through the records. "The consulting payments increased significantly during the last 2 years." I understood the implication immediately. The last 2 years were when Charles's health had deteriorated the most. When he was no longer reviewing financial reports personally. When Ryan had the most control. "Which means oversight inside the company was reduced," I said quietly. Michael nodded. "Exactly." I leaned back slightly in the chair. Ryan hadn't just stolen money. He had done it slowly and carefully, hiding the transactions inside legitimate vendor payments. And he had believed no one would ever examine the pattern closely enough to see what was happening. But there was still one question left. Michael, I asked calmly, who owns Apex Urban Solutions? Michael shook his head. That's the strange part. He turned the screen again so I could see another report. The company itself does not appear in any domestic business registry. Shell company, a classic strategy in financial fraud. Create a company that exists only on paper, route money through it, move the funds offshore. But shell companies still require someone controlling the account behind them, and whoever controlled that account would be connected to the missing millions. I stood up slowly. Thank you, Michael. He looked concerned. Mrs. Whitaker, if what you're suggesting is true, this situation goes far beyond a probate dispute. Yes, I said quietly. Linda and I walked out of the bank into the afternoon sunlight. The streets were busy, but everything around me felt strangely calm. Because the investigation Charles had started before his death was now moving forward again. What happens next? Linda asked. I looked down at the folder of documents in my hands. Now we present the numbers. 2 days later, we returned to the courthouse for the next hearing. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was completely different now. Word had spread that the case might involve financial misconduct inside Whitaker Development Group. People filled nearly every seat in the gallery. Ryan was already seated at the plaintiff's table when I entered. But the confident smirk he had worn during the first hearing was gone. Daniel Mercer looked exhausted, flipping through legal papers as if trying to anticipate something he could no longer control. Judge Samuel Carter entered and the courtroom rose. Be seated, he said calmly. Mercer stood first, attempting to regain control of the narrative. Your Honor, the plaintiff maintains that Charles Whitaker's final will was executed under undue influence. But his voice lacked the certainty it had carried before. Because he knew what was coming next. When Judge Carter asked whether the defense had evidence to present, I stood and walked toward the center of the courtroom. Yes, Your Honor, I said calmly. The defense would like to submit financial records showing the movement of company funds over the last 5 years. I placed the documents on the clerk's desk. Judge Carter began reading them slowly. The entire room remained silent. Finally, he looked up. These records indicate repeated transfers to offshore accounts. Yes, Your Honor. The judge turned toward Ryan. Mr. Whitaker, were you responsible for approving these payments? Ryan's throat tightened. He glanced briefly at Mercer before answering. Yes, he said carefully. They were consulting payments. Judge Carter lifted another document. Nearly $37 million in consulting fees. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. Large development projects require specialized consultants. A few quiet murmurs moved through the courtroom. I waited until the room settled again before speaking. Your Honor, there is one additional document the court should review. The judge nodded. Proceed. I placed the final page on the clerk's desk. The corporate registration search for Apex Urban Solutions. Judge Carter read the page carefully. Then he looked up slowly. This time his expression had changed completely. Mr. Whitaker, he said quietly, according to this record, Apex Urban Solutions does not legally exist. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened in the courtroom so far. Ryan's face lost its color. Daniel Mercer closed his eyes briefly as if he had just watched a carefully built bridge collapse. Because in that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood the same thing. The financial trail no longer pointed toward suspicion. It pointed directly at Ryan Whitaker. And when Judge Carter leaned forward and spoke again, the entire courtroom realized this case was no longer just about a contested will. It had become something much larger. When Judge Samuel Carter finished reading the document confirming that Apex Urban Solutions did not legally exist, the entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Not the spectators in the gallery, not Daniel Mercer, not even my stepson, Ryan Whitaker. And in that silence, something important happened. The story Ryan had carefully constructed for months, the story of a grieving son fighting a manipulative widow, collapsed completely. Judge Carter placed the document down slowly on the bench and looked directly at Ryan. His voice was calm, but there was weight behind every word. Mr. Whitaker, he said, These financial records indicate that millions of dollars were transferred from Whitaker Development Group to a company that does not appear to exist in any corporate registry. Ryan swallowed hard but forced a small laugh. Your Honor, international consulting companies often operate through subsidiaries. The judge raised an eyebrow. Subsidiaries typically have registration records. Ryan shifted in his chair. For the first time since this case began, he looked uncertain. Daniel Mercer stood quickly, trying to regain control of the moment. Your Honor, without a full financial audit, these interpretations are speculative. My client maintains that all company expenditures were legitimate business decisions. Judge Carter looked back at the stack of financial documents. Legitimate decisions totaling over $37 million? A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. People leaned forward in their seats, because everyone now understood the situation was no longer just about a will dispute. The judge turned toward me. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, you indicated these transactions were discovered while reviewing the company's records. Would you care to explain how that occurred? I stood slowly from my seat. For a moment I looked across the room at Ryan, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, only with quiet disappointment. Then I faced the judge. My husband Charles Whitaker built his company over 40 years, I began calmly. He valued honesty in business above everything else. I paused briefly, letting the words settle in the room. During the final months of his life, he began noticing irregularities in the company's finances, but his illness prevented him from finishing the investigation himself. The courtroom remained silent. Before he passed away, I continued, Charles left certain records in my care. I lifted the notebook Charles had hidden inside the safe in his study. Those records contain notes regarding consulting payments that did not match legitimate vendor activity. Judge Carter nodded slowly. And what did your review reveal? I held up the financial documents Michael Bennett had verified. Over 5 years, nearly $37 million was transferred through consulting contracts to a shell entity. Ryan suddenly slammed his hand on the table. That's not true, his voice echoed across the room, but the strength behind it was gone, because the numbers were already sitting on the judge's desk, and numbers are very difficult to argue with. Daniel Mercer stepped forward quickly. Your Honor, we strongly object to these accusations being presented without a full investigation. I looked at him calmly. A full investigation would confirm exactly what these records already show. Mercer hesitated. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, studying Ryan carefully now. Then he spoke the words that changed everything. This court finds that the plaintiff's challenge to the will lacks credible foundation. The sound of the gavel echoed once through the courtroom. The will of Charles Whitaker will stand as written. A murmur of relief moved through the gallery behind me, but Judge Carter was not finished. He looked again at the financial documents before him. However, he continued slowly, the financial evidence presented raises serious concerns regarding potential misuse of company funds. Ryan's face turned pale. You can't be serious, he whispered. The judge's voice became colder. This court will be referring these records to the appropriate financial authorities for further investigation. The words struck the room like thunder. 2 courthouse security officers quietly stepped closer to Ryan's table. Daniel Mercer slowly closed his briefcase. For the first time since the case began, the famous attorney who built his reputation by overwhelming opponents looked completely defeated. He leaned toward Ryan and spoke quietly. Do not say another word. But it was already too late. Ryan's expression revealed everything. The hearing ended shortly after that. People in the gallery began standing, whispering among themselves as they filed out of the courtroom. Some of them glanced at me with curiosity, others with respect. But I didn't stay for their attention. I walked quietly out into the hallway. Linda Alvarez was waiting for me there, her eyes already filled with emotion. Charles would be proud of you, she said softly. I nodded gently. He always believed the truth would come out eventually. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sunlight reflected off the glass buildings across the street. For the first time since Charles's funeral, the world felt calm again. Not because the battle had been easy, but because the truth had finally been allowed to speak. Months later, the investigation confirmed everything the financial records had suggested. Ryan Whitaker eventually accepted a legal settlement rather than face a full financial fraud trial. The offshore accounts connected to Apex Urban Solutions were seized. A large portion of the stolen funds was recovered and returned to Whitaker Development Group. And the company Charles built continued operating under new leadership that respected the values he believed in. But the most important part of the story wasn't the money, it was the lesson. Society often looks at older women and assumes they are fragile or powerless, or past the moment when they can defend themselves. People see gray hair and quiet voices and assume experience means weakness. But they forget something very important. Experience is not weakness. Experience is knowledge. And knowledge becomes very powerful when someone underestimates you. Today, I still live in the same house Charles and I shared overlooking the ocean. Linda still manages the household, though these days she likes to joke that she is my strategic advisor. And sometimes in the evening, when I sit on the porch watching the waves roll toward the shore, I think about that moment in the courtroom when Ryan laughed and called me just a homemaker. He believed that word meant powerless, but what he never understood was something simple. A woman's strength does not disappear when she chooses a quieter life. Sometimes it simply waits until the moment it is needed again. And when that moment arrives, the people who underestimated her are usually the ones who regret it the most. So if you ever find yourself in a moment where someone tries to diminish your worth, remember this. You are never just anything, and the people who underestimate you today may someday wish they hadn't. Thank you for listening to my story. And if this story reminded you that dignity and truth always matter, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the strongest lessons.